The morning of September 15th, 1944, on the island of Peleliu, began with an eerie silence that Japanese Major General Takeshi Ikeda would later describe in his diary as the quiet before the storm that would consume us. At exactly 08:30 hours, forward observers from the 1st Marine Division spotted movement near the ridgeline positions held by the Japanese 14th Infantry Division. Intelligence reports suggested approximately 300 enemy troops were consolidating for a counterattack against Marine positions established the previous night. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What happened next would become a defining moment in the evolution of modern artillery warfare, a demonstration of coordination so precise that Japanese commanders would have less than 4 minutes from the first warning to the moment 144 shells arrived simultaneously on target. The Marines had developed something extraordinary, something the Japanese had never encountered before. It wasn't just about firepower, though the Marine Corps had plenty of that. It was about time-on-target artillery, a fire control technique that synchronized multiple artillery batteries firing from different locations at different ranges so that every single shell arrived at the target in the same few seconds. The concept sounds simple until you understand the mathematics, physics, and communication systems required to make it work. Artillery has always been about timing, but historically that timing was sequential. One gun fired, then another, then another. Observers would watch where the shells landed and call corrections. Fire for effect would come in waves, giving defenders time to take cover between salvos. Time on target changed everything. Instead of sequential fire creating waves of explosions, every gun fired at precisely calculated intervals so that shells with different flight times all arrived together. A howitzer 2 miles from the target fired earlier than one only 1 mile away. A battery at higher elevation adjusted its timing differently than one at lower elevation. Wind speed, temperature, barometric pressure, every variable that affected shell trajectory had to be calculated not just for accuracy, but for precise timing. The Marine Corps had been developing time-on-target procedures since 1942, incorporating lessons learned in North Africa and refined through campaigns across the Pacific. By Peleliu, they had perfected it into a system that could coordinate up to 12 separate batteries, delivering massed fire with frightening precision. The artillery supporting the 1st Marine Division on Peleliu consisted of multiple battalions equipped with 75mm pack howitzers and 105mm howitzers. These weapons had been positioned in carefully surveyed locations established within hours of the initial landing. Survey teams had used theodolites and measuring chains to create precise fire control grids. Every gun position was plotted relative to known reference points. Every potential target area was pre-registered, with calculated firing data prepared in advance. Communications networks connected forward observers with fire direction centers which coordinated with individual batteries. The system was complex, involving layers of coordination that had to function perfectly under combat conditions. The forward observer who spotted the Japanese troop concentration that morning was 2nd Lieutenant James Morrison from 3rd Battalion, 11th Marines. Morrison was positioned in a shell crater approximately 800 yards from the enemy movement. He had a radio, a map marked with pre-registered target coordinates, and binoculars. Through the binoculars, Morrison could see Japanese soldiers moving through vegetation. They were not attempting concealment. They appeared to be forming up for an organized movement, possibly preparing to counterattack Marine positions or reinforcing defensive positions further inland. Morrison keyed his radio and transmitted to the Fire Direction Center. His message was concise, using pre-arranged brevity codes. He identified the target location using grid coordinates, estimated the size of the concentration at approximately 300 personnel, and requested time on target fire mission. The request went to Captain Robert Hayes at the Fire Direction Center for the 11th Marines. Hayes and his team worked in a dugout position, protected by sandbags and camouflage netting, surrounded by maps, calculation tables, and communication equipment. When Morrison's request came through, Hayes made an immediate assessment. The target was significant enough to justify a full time-on-target mission. The location was within range of multiple batteries. There were no friendly forces in the impact area. He approved the mission, and his team began the complex calculations required to execute it. The Fire Direction Center had to solve multiple problems simultaneously. First, determine which batteries would participate. They selected 4 batteries, each with 4 guns, providing 16 total firing platforms. This would deliver 144 shells if each gun fired 9 rounds in the time-on-target sequence. Second, calculate the range and azimuth from each gun position to the target. Every battery was at a different location with different range to target. Third, calculate the time of flight for shells fired from each position. This required knowing the muzzle velocity of the specific ammunition lot being used, accounting for temperature effects on propellant, factoring in wind speed and direction at different altitudes along the shell's trajectory, and adjusting for barometric pressure. Fourth, work backward from a common impact time to determine when each gun needed to fire. The gun furthest from the target would fire first. The gun closest would fire last. The interval between guns firing might be only seconds, but those seconds had to be calculated precisely. The calculations were done using firing tables, slide rules, and mental arithmetic. There were no computers, no digital calculators. Fire direction officers and their teams had trained for months to perform these calculations quickly and accurately under pressure. Within 3 minutes of Morrison's initial call, Hayes had calculated the firing data and was transmitting orders to the participating batteries. Each battery received specific instructions: the target coordinates, the charge to use, the deflection setting for each gun, the quadrant elevation, and most critically, the exact time to fire. Battery commanders received these orders and immediately began preparing their guns. Ammunition handlers retrieved the correct rounds. Gun crews adjusted their weapons according to the firing data. Officers synchronized their watches to ensure timing, precision. The Japanese had no idea what was about to happen. Their doctrine included awareness of artillery threats, but their experience was primarily with sequential fire. Japanese artillery tactics emphasized carefully coordinated barrages, but not the kind of split-second timing the Marines were preparing to execute. Japanese forward observers, if they had spotted the Marine artillery preparation, would have seen guns being prepared, but would have had no way to predict the coordinated strike about to occur. The Japanese troops concentrating near the ridgeline were likely unaware they had been spotted. They were approximately 800 yards from Morrison's position, but terrain and vegetation provided concealment from most angles. They were probably confident in their position, possibly preparing to move to new defensive positions as part of the flexible defense strategy the Japanese had adopted on Peleliu. Major General Ikeda, commanding Japanese forces in that sector, had established headquarters in a cave system approximately 1 mile from the concentration Morrison had spotted. Ikeda had fought against American forces before. He had experienced American artillery fire. He understood the destructive power of concentrated fire. What he could not have anticipated was the precision and coordination the Marines had achieved. At 0842 hours, 12 minutes after Morrison's initial spot report, the fire mission was ready. 16 guns across 4 batteries were loaded, aimed, and prepared to fire. Each gun crew was watching their battery commander, waiting for the signal. The battery commanders were watching their synchronized timepieces, counting down to the precise second they had been ordered to fire. At different locations across the Marine artillery positions, separated by hundreds of yards, gun crews waited in their firing positions. The forward guns, closer to the target, had crews standing ready but would not fire for several more seconds. The rear guns, furthest from the target, would fire first. At 0843 hours and 15 seconds, the first battery fired. 4 guns discharged almost simultaneously, a rolling thunder that echoed across the island. The shells arced upward, following ballistic trajectories calculated to bring them down on the target area in exactly 37 seconds. 3 seconds later, the second battery fired, then the third battery, then the fourth battery. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The sequence took approximately 12 seconds from first gun to last gun. To anyone watching, it would have appeared to be normal artillery fire, guns firing in fairly rapid sequence. There was nothing obviously unusual about the pattern. The shells were invisible in flight. At the target area, Japanese soldiers heard the first distant boom of artillery fire. This was not unusual. American artillery had been firing intermittently since the landing. The sound of guns firing did not necessarily mean incoming fire on their specific position. Some soldiers may have looked up, scanning the sky for aircraft, or trying to determine where the artillery was aimed. Others continued whatever tasks they were performing, trusting that if the fire was directed at them, they would hear the distinctive whistle of incoming shells in time to take cover. That warning never came. The whistle of incoming artillery shells is caused by air turbulence around the projectile as it descends. A single shell produces a distinctive sound that arrives several seconds before impact, giving experienced soldiers time to dive for cover. 144 shells arriving simultaneously produce no advance warning. The sound of their approach is masked by the sound of impact. At 08:43 hours and 52 seconds, 37 seconds after the first guns fired, 144 high-explosive shells struck a target area, measuring approximately 150 yards by 100 yards. The explosions were not sequential. They were simultaneous, or as close to simultaneous as the physics of artillery fire allowed. Within a 2-second window, every single shell detonated. The sound was unlike anything most witnesses had experienced. Instead of the rolling thunder of sequential artillery fire, the time-on-target barrage produced a single massive concussion that could be felt miles away. Marines in forward positions reported that the ground shook. Japanese defenders in nearby cave positions reported ceiling collapses from the shock wave. The physical effects on the target area were catastrophic. 144 high-explosive shells, each containing several pounds of explosive compound and hundreds of steel fragments, detonated in overlapping patterns across the target area. There was no place to take cover because every square yard of the target area was simultaneously under fire. There was no time to react because the explosions all occurred in the same instant. The Japanese soldiers in the target area had perhaps 2 seconds from the moment they might have heard the shells descending to the moment of impact. Insufficient time to drop prone, insufficient time to reach cover, insufficient time to do anything except experience the terror of realization followed immediately by the impact. The casualty rate was devastating. Post-battle assessment estimated that between 250 and 280 of the approximately 300 Japanese soldiers in the target area were killed or severely wounded in those first 2 seconds. The survivors, perhaps 20 to 50 men, were scattered, disoriented, many suffering from blast injuries, perforated eardrums, and shock. The planned Japanese movement, whatever its objective had been, was annihilated before it could begin. Lieutenant Morrison, observing from his shell crater, reported the impact. His message to the Fire Direction Center was brief. Target destroyed. Estimate 250 enemy casualties. No further movement observed. The entire sequence from initial spot report to target destruction had taken 13 minutes. From the first gun firing to impact had been 37 seconds. From the Japanese perspective, they had gone from normal operations to complete devastation in less time than it takes to read this paragraph. Major General Ikeda, in his cave headquarters, felt the concussion. He immediately demanded reports from forward units. Communications with the targeted unit were impossible. The radios had been destroyed or the operators killed. Adjacent units reported only that they had witnessed massive explosions and that there was no longer any visible activity in the area where the concentration had been. Ikeda understood immediately what had happened. The Americans had achieved coordinated fire on a scale he had not encountered before. In his diary, recovered after the battle, he wrote, "The enemy demonstrates artillery coordination we cannot match. They struck without warning with power we cannot defend against. Our men had no chance to take cover. This is not warfare as we have trained for. This is industrial destruction applied with scientific precision." The time-on-target technique represented a fundamental shift in how artillery could be employed. Throughout military history, artillery had been powerful but relatively slow. Gunners fired, observers watched, corrections were made, and fire for effect followed. This process gave defenders time to react, time to take cover, time to move. Time on target eliminated that response window. It transformed artillery from a weapon that suppressed and damaged into a weapon that annihilated. The mathematics behind time on target were complex, but not impossibly so. What made it effective was not theoretical breakthrough but practical implementation. The Marine Corps had invested in training, in communication systems, in surveying techniques, and in fire control procedures that allowed them to execute the technique reliably under combat conditions. Every forward observer was trained to call for time-on-target missions. Every fire direction center was equipped to calculate the necessary firing data. Every battery commander understood the importance of precise timing. The system worked because every element of the system was trained to work together. The Japanese had capable artillery. They had skilled gunners. What they lacked was the training infrastructure, the communication systems, and perhaps most importantly, the fire control doctrine that made time on target possible. Japanese artillery tactics emphasized careful preparation and concentration of fire, but execution was typically sequential. Batteries fired in turn, creating rolling barrages that were powerful but allowed defenders time to react. The development of time-on-target artillery had not happened by accident. It was the product of systematic analysis, training, innovation, and technological integration that had begun years before the 1st Marine Division landed on Peleliu. The story of how the Marine Corps developed this capability reveals as much about American military culture as it does about artillery science. In 1942, artillery officers at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the home of Army artillery training, had begun experimenting with coordinated fire techniques. The concept was not entirely new. Artillery theorists had discussed simultaneous impact fire for decades. What changed in the early 1940s was the recognition that modern communication systems and improved fire control mathematics made the concept practically achievable. The early experiments were crude. Battery commanders would synchronize their watches and attempt to fire at the same moment. The results were inconsistent. Even when guns fired simultaneously, differences in range meant shells arrived at different times. The breakthrough came when fire control officers realized they needed to think backward from impact time rather than forward from firing time. Instead of trying to fire simultaneously, they calculated when each gun needed to fire so that shells with different flight times would arrive together. The calculations required precise knowledge of ballistic performance. Gunners needed to know exactly how long a shell would take to travel from gun to target at any given range and elevation. They needed to account for variables that affected flight time, including air temperature, which changed propellant burn rate and muzzle velocity, barometric pressure, which affected air density and therefore drag on the shell during flight, wind speed and direction at various altitudes along the trajectory, and even the wear condition of the gun barrel, which affected muzzle velocity. Fire control officers developed tables that organized this data. The tables were organized by weapon type, ammunition, lot, and environmental conditions. A fire direction officer could look up the expected time of flight for a shell fired under specific conditions and use that information to calculate when the gun needed to fire. The tables were not perfect. They represented average conditions and expected performance. Real-world variables meant that shells never flew exactly as the tables predicted, but the tables were accurate enough that with proper technique, fire direction centers could achieve shell impacts within a 2 to 3 second window, close enough to overwhelm any defender's ability to react. Communication systems were equally critical. Time on target missions required coordination across multiple batteries, often spread across several square miles of terrain. Radio communication made this possible. By 1944, the Marine Corps had equipped artillery units with reliable radio sets that could maintain contact even under difficult conditions. The SCR-193 radio set, commonly used in artillery fire direction centers, could communicate over distances of up to 20 miles under good conditions. Forward observers carried lighter SCR-300 sets that could reach fire direction centers from several miles away. These communication systems allowed forward observers to call for fire support and allowed fire direction centers to coordinate multiple batteries in real time. Without radio, time-on-target missions would have been impossible. The human element was perhaps most important. Time on target required training, discipline, and trust. Forward observers needed to trust that when they called for time on target, the shells would arrive where requested. Fire direction officers needed to trust their calculations and their communication with battery commanders. Battery commanders needed to trust that their guns were properly maintained and that their crews would execute precisely. Gun crews needed to trust that when they fired at the ordered time, other batteries were doing the same, and that their shells would not fall short or hit friendly positions. This trust was built through repetitive training. Artillery units practiced time-on-target missions repeatedly, first with dummy rounds, then with live fire on training ranges, and finally in combat conditions. By the time the 1st Marine Division landed on Peleliu, time-on-target fire missions were routine procedures that artillery units executed with confidence. The Japanese had no equivalent capability. This was not due to lack of intelligence or military competence. Japanese artillery units were well trained, and Japanese gunners were skilled. The limitation was systematic. Japanese military doctrine emphasized different priorities. Japanese artillery was organized primarily to support planned offensive operations. Fire control procedures emphasized careful preparation, with artillery positions selected and surveyed well in advance. Firing data was calculated thoroughly and double-checked. This approach worked well for set-piece attacks, but was less flexible when facing rapidly changing tactical situations. Japanese communication systems were also less developed. Radio sets were less common in Japanese artillery units. Communication often relied on telephone lines, which were vulnerable to damage from enemy fire. When telephone lines were cut, communication fell back to runners or visual signals, which were slow and unreliable. The combination of less flexible doctrine and less reliable communications meant that Japanese artillery could not execute the kind of rapid, precisely coordinated fire missions that time on target required. The impact of time-on-target artillery on Peleliu extended far beyond that single mission on the morning of September 15th. Over the following weeks, Marine artillery units executed dozens of time-on-target missions. Each mission demonstrated the same devastating effectiveness. Japanese forces, attempting to maneuver, were caught in the open and annihilated. Japanese positions that revealed themselves through activity were targeted and destroyed before defenders could react. Japanese counterattacks were broken up before they could develop momentum. Major General Ikeda adapted as best he could. He ordered units to move only at night, to use covered routes whenever possible, and to maintain strict dispersion to avoid presenting concentrated targets. These measures helped reduce casualties from time-on-target missions, but they also reduced the effectiveness of Japanese operations. Units that maintained dispersion could not mass for counterattacks. Units that moved only at night and used covered routes moved more slowly and with greater difficulty. The tactical flexibility that Japanese forces needed to conduct their defense was constrained by the constant threat of time-on-target artillery. Japanese soldiers learned to fear American artillery in a way that went beyond the normal fear of shell fire. Artillery had always been dangerous, but it had been survivable. A soldier who heard shells incoming had time to take cover. A soldier in a well-prepared position could survive all but a direct hit. Time-on-target artillery changed those assumptions. There was no warning. There was no time to react. A soldier could be walking across open ground one moment and dead the next, killed by explosions that arrived without warning from multiple directions simultaneously. The psychological impact was profound. Japanese soldiers became increasingly reluctant to move during daylight. Units stayed in covered positions even when tactical situations demanded movement. Commanders found it difficult to motivate men to take necessary risks when those risks included exposure to artillery that could arrive without warning and against which there was no defense. This psychological pressure, combined with the physical casualties inflicted by time-on-target missions, degraded Japanese combat effectiveness throughout the Peleliu campaign. The American experience was equally instructive. Forward observers gained confidence in their ability to call devastating fire support. Infantry units learned that when they encountered Japanese positions, they could request time-on-target missions and expect results. The psychological advantage of knowing that overwhelming firepower was available on demand was significant. Marines operating in difficult terrain against a determined enemy could maintain offensive momentum because they knew artillery support was just a radio call away. The coordination between infantry and artillery that time-on-target missions required also strengthened combined arms integration. Forward observers worked closely with infantry units, sharing information and coordinating operations. Fire direction centers maintained constant communication with forward units, tracking friendly positions and identifying potential targets. Battery crews understood that their work was directly supporting Marines in contact with the enemy. This integration created a combined arms team that was greater than the sum of its parts. The technical achievement of time-on-target artillery was remarkable, but it existed within a larger context of American military capability. Time-on-target missions were effective because they were supported by extensive logistics, reliable equipment, and comprehensive training. The ammunition expenditure required for time-on-target missions was substantial. A single mission might fire 144 shells. Multiple missions per day could consume thousands of rounds. The Marine Corps logistics system could sustain this rate of fire because American industry produced ammunition in enormous quantities, and American logistics units could deliver it to forward positions efficiently. Japanese forces faced the opposite situation. Japanese artillery units were chronically short of ammunition. Japanese industry could not produce shells in quantities sufficient to sustain intensive fire missions. Japanese logistics could not reliably deliver ammunition to forward units, especially as American submarines and aircraft interdicted supply lines. Even if Japanese artillery units had possessed time-on-target capabilities, they could not have executed missions at the rate American units did because they lacked the ammunition. The equipment reliability was equally important. American artillery pieces were well maintained and consistently reliable. Gun crews could trust that their weapons would fire when needed and that ammunition would perform as expected. Japanese artillery, while well designed, suffered from maintenance issues and ammunition quality problems that increased as the war progressed. Guns wore out from use and could not always be replaced or repaired. Ammunition manufactured under wartime conditions with limited quality control sometimes failed to perform as specified. These reliability issues made precision fire control more difficult and reduced confidence in artillery effectiveness. The training infrastructure that supported American artillery was comprehensive and continuous. Artillerymen received extensive initial training at facilities like Fort Sill, where they learned fire control procedures, communication techniques, and gunnery skills. Training continued in unit assignments with regular practice and qualification exercises. When new techniques like time-on-target fire were developed, training programs disseminated the knowledge rapidly throughout the artillery force. By 1944, time-on-target procedures were being taught to new artillery officers as standard doctrine. Japanese artillery training, while thorough, was less adaptive. Training programs were established and followed structured curricula, but there was less emphasis on continuous improvement and innovation. When Japanese artillery encountered American capabilities like time-on-target fire, there was no systematic process for analyzing the technique, developing countermeasures, and disseminating new tactics throughout the force. Individual units might adapt based on experience, but learning was local rather than systematic. The Battle of Peleliu lasted from September 15th through November 27th, 1944. Over those 73 days, time-on-target artillery missions accounted for a significant portion of Japanese casualties. Exact numbers are difficult to determine because casualties from different causes often overlapped, but post-battle analysis estimated that coordinated artillery fire, including time-on-target missions, killed or wounded at least 2,000 Japanese soldiers during the campaign. The broader significance of time-on-target artillery extended beyond Peleliu. The technique was used throughout the remaining Pacific campaigns. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, Marine artillery units executed time-on-target missions against Japanese positions throughout the island. At Okinawa from April through June 1945, both Marine and Army artillery units employed the technique extensively. In each campaign, Time-on-target fire proved effective at disrupting Japanese operations and inflicting casualties. The technique also influenced post-war artillery doctrine. After the war, time-on-target procedures became standard training for artillery units in Western militaries. The concept was refined with improved fire control computers that could calculate firing data more quickly and accurately. Modern artillery can execute time-on-target missions with even greater precision, coordinating not just multiple batteries but multiple artillery battalions, firing different types of munitions to achieve specific effects on target. The legacy of time-on-target artillery is visible in modern military operations. The principle of coordinated, simultaneous impact fire remains central to artillery doctrine. The importance of training, communication, and fire control procedures that made time-on-target possible in 1944 remains relevant today. The integration of artillery with infantry operations that time-on-target missions demonstrated continues to define effective combined arms warfare. For the Japanese commanders and soldiers who experienced time-on-target artillery on Peleliu and other Pacific battlefields, the technique represented something more immediate and personal. It represented the material superiority that American forces brought to every engagement. It represented the industrial capacity that allowed American units to expend ammunition at rates Japanese forces could never match. It represented the training and coordination that American military culture emphasized and that Japanese forces struggled to counter. Major General Ikeda's diary entries from Peleliu reveal his growing understanding of the impossible situation Japanese forces faced. In early entries, he focused on tactical matters, discussing defensive positions and counterattack plans. As the campaign progressed and Japanese forces experienced repeated time-on-target missions, his tone changed. Later entries focused on the systematic destruction of his units by American firepower that arrived with precision and overwhelming force. One entry from late September, approximately 2 weeks into the campaign, is particularly revealing. Today, another company was destroyed by coordinated American artillery. They had moved into position under cover of darkness. At dawn, while preparing defensive positions, the American shells arrived all at once. There was no warning. There was nothing they could do. 70 men were killed or wounded in seconds. The survivors could not even retrieve the bodies because American observers watch every movement, and more shells arrive immediately. We cannot move during day. We cannot concentrate our forces. We cannot launch effective counterattacks. We can only wait in our positions, while American forces advance with artillery support we cannot match. The entry captures the essential reality of the Peleliu campaign and the broader Pacific War. Japanese forces were fighting with courage and skill, but they were fighting against systematic material advantages they could not overcome. Time-on-target artillery was one example among many of how American industrial capacity, technological development, and military organization combined to create overwhelming combat power. The 4 minutes that Japanese commanders had from first warning to impact of time-on-target missions was actually generous compared to the reality most soldiers experienced. Forward units caught in the open often had no warning at all. The first indication of incoming fire was the sound of explosions. By then, it was too late. Those 4 minutes applied only to commanders in rear positions who might hear distant gunfire and recognize what was coming. For the men at the target area, there was no warning and no time to react. This absence of warning was deliberate. Time-on-target technique was designed specifically to eliminate the defender's reaction time. It transformed artillery from a weapon that defenders could take cover from into a weapon that caught defenders in the open and annihilated them. The psychological impact of this transformation was as important as the physical casualties. Soldiers who know they might be killed without warning experience constant stress that degrades performance and morale. The Marine Corps understood this psychological dimension. Training materials for forward observers explicitly discussed the morale effects of time-on-target fire. Observers were encouraged to call for time-on-target missions, not just when large enemy concentrations were visible, but whenever they could identify any significant target. The goal was not just to inflict casualties, but to create an environment where Japanese forces were constantly threatened by artillery that could arrive without warning. Over time, this constant threat wore down Japanese combat effectiveness as much as the actual casualties did. The Japanese had no effective countermeasures. Dispersion helped reduce casualties from any single mission but made it difficult to mass forces for offensive action. Covered movement helped avoid observation but was slow and limited tactical flexibility. Improved camouflage and deception could sometimes prevent forward observers from spotting targets, but the Marines had aerial reconnaissance and could identify positions from above. Night movement avoided observation by forward observers, but left units exhausted and vulnerable during daylight hours. Some Japanese commanders attempted to suppress American forward observers, sending patrols to hunt for observation positions. This had limited success. Forward observers operated in small teams, were difficult to locate, and were typically protected by infantry security elements. Even when Japanese patrols succeeded in forcing an observer to withdraw, new observers would establish positions elsewhere within hours. The systematic approach American forces took to fire control meant that eliminating one observer did not significantly degrade overall artillery effectiveness. The fundamental problem Japanese forces faced was not tactical but strategic. They were fighting a defensive campaign with limited resources against an enemy with overwhelming material superiority. Time-on-target artillery was one manifestation of that superiority, but it was part of a larger pattern. American forces had better artillery, better ammunition, better communications, better logistics, better training, and better coordination. No tactical adaptation could overcome those systematic advantages. By late October 1944, 6 weeks into the Peleliu campaign, Japanese resistance had been compressed into a small area in the northern part of the island. American forces controlled most of the island and had established secure positions. Japanese forces held a complex of caves and fortified positions in the rocky terrain known as the Umabrogel Ridge. The fighting continued, but the outcome was not in doubt. Japanese forces could delay but not prevent American victory. Time-on-target artillery continued to play a role even in this final phase. Marine artillery units fired missions against cave entrances, supply routes, and any Japanese movement they could observe. The missions were smaller in scale than earlier in the campaign because Japanese forces were dispersed and hidden, but they remained effective at constraining Japanese operations and inflicting casualties. The constant artillery fire, including regular time-on-target missions, prevented Japanese forces from massing for any significant counterattack and gradually wore down remaining defenders. The Peleliu campaign officially ended on November 27, 1944, although isolated Japanese soldiers continued to hide in caves for months afterward. The campaign had been costly for both sides. American forces suffered approximately 10,000 casualties, including 2,000 killed. Japanese forces suffered approximately 11,000 casualties with fewer than 300 prisoners taken. The intensity of combat and the casualty rates reflected the determination of both sides and the brutal nature of Pacific Island warfare. Within this larger context of intense combat, time-on-target artillery represented a specific tactical advantage that American forces exploited throughout the campaign. The technique did not win the battle by itself. Victory required the combined efforts of infantry, artillery, engineers, air support, logistics, and naval gunfire support. But time-on-target artillery contributed significantly by disrupting Japanese operations, inflicting casualties, and creating psychological pressure that degraded Japanese combat effectiveness. The soldiers who fought on Peleliu, both American and Japanese, experienced time-on-target artillery differently based on which side they were on. For Marines, time-on-target missions represented available firepower that could be called upon when needed. They knew that if they encountered resistance, they could request artillery support, and that support would arrive with devastating effect. This knowledge provided confidence and allowed infantry units to maintain offensive pressure even against strong defensive positions. For Japanese soldiers, time-on-target artillery represented unpredictable death that could arrive without warning. They learned to fear open ground and daylight movement. They learned that concentrating forces invited annihilation. They learned that American firepower was both overwhelming and precisely directed. These lessons shaped their behavior and constrained their tactical options throughout the campaign. The technical achievement of time-on-target artillery was remarkable. The ability to coordinate multiple batteries firing from different positions at different ranges so that all shells arrived within a 2 to 3 second window required sophisticated fire control procedures, reliable communications, trained personnel, and quality equipment. The Marine Corps had developed all of these elements and integrated them into a system that functioned reliably under combat conditions. But perhaps more remarkable than the technical achievement was the systematic approach that made it possible. Time-on-target artillery worked because it was part of a comprehensive military system that emphasized training, standardization, communication, and continuous improvement. Fire control procedures were documented and taught systematically. Communication equipment was reliable and widely distributed. Training programs ensured that personnel at every level understood their roles. The system worked because every element of the system was designed to work together. This systematic approach reflected broader American military culture. The American Armed Forces in World War II emphasized standardization, training, and technological solutions to military problems. When a technique like time-on-target artillery proved effective, it was quickly incorporated into doctrine. Training programs were updated to teach the technique, and the knowledge spread throughout the force. This ability to identify effective practices, standardize them, and disseminate them rapidly gave American forces significant advantages in operational effectiveness. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.